welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hello.
So today we are continuing our series on obsession with Thomas Bernhard's The Limeworks. If you want to join our discussion, go look for our book club on Reddit. You can find that by clicking on the link in the episode description. And you can support us in your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link, which is also in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we'll be having an in-depth discussion of The Limeworks. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. So let's talk about why this book is important.
This book and Thomas Bernhard is it's just one of those novelists that you don't really think about or know about unless somebody clues you in. Like, I never see him on lists. I never see him really talked about, especially in the American book press. But he's actually quite well known in Europe. He was an Austrian writer. He was active as a novelist, a dramatist, and a poet, mostly from the 1960s through the 80s. He died in 1989. In Europe, he's held in quite high regard. People consider him to be one of the most prominent European writers of the 20th century. And to my mind, I've read two of his novels now. This is the second. He definitely deserves the praise. I think you can definitely compare him quite favorably to Samuel Beckett. This novel that we read, The Limeworks, was published in 1970, and I think it's a good encapsulation of his style and his subject matter. I'm sure we're going to talk more about his style later on because it is very strong and noticeable. The subject matter is the alienation of the individual, an individual who's a man of quote-unquote genius. In this novel, that genius is a man called Conrad, who has retreated to an abandoned limeworks in the Austrian countryside with his disabled wife, so he can devote, or you could say sacrifice, their lives to what he considers the study of the sense of hearing. He wants to create a book called The Sense of Hearing.
I think I'll add that for me, a central theme in this book is the inability for people to communicate, especially for Conrad in this novel. So we have, for example, Conrad's inability to write his treatise, which is on a scientific exploration of hearing, scientific kind of in quotation marks here, because I don't know how scientific it actually is. How Conrad has decided to isolate him and his wife from the world, how he subjects his wife to these hearing exercises where he's trying to see if she can hear him and what specifically she can hear. Also, the style of novel is kind of in the manner of disjointed testimony, which challenges the reader to try to piece things together. But I think ultimately you'd say that it is very difficult to piece things together to create a coherent whole.
One major thing that I had left out was that at the beginning of the novel, he does kill his wife. We're told that he kills his wife, but we don't know exactly how it happened.
Right. We're told that he shoots her. We are given the gun, but the whole story is told to us through a third-person account. Not third person as in he, she, but as in Conrad tells someone else what happened, who then tells our narrator, who is an insurance salesman, but isn't really a character in and of themselves. They're kind of a shell.
For me, it does start with the murder, and I think it's set up as a kind of murder mystery in that you're trying to figure out why he murdered his wife, or if he did in fact murder his wife. It's framed that way, even though it in fact, I would say, is not a murder mystery, but it kind of winks at the reader a little bit when it starts off with that murder and with his arrest. And for me, that is kind of the bait on the hook, to borrow a phrase that you used previously, because so much of the book is hard to read. Like at the very beginning of the book, I think that's the thing that tries to bring the reader along.
You feel like you're being teased a little bit to to keep following that carrot?
Uh, a little bit, yeah. I mean, he begins the book with something sensational, and then the book devolves to something really boring for like 100 pages. I thought the first half of the book was probably the worst thing I've read in a really long time. But I thought the second half of the book rescued it for me, because the first half of the book essentially struck one note again and again, and it's really dull and repetitive, which is the point. He's undertaking this kind of experimental style, and if you are trying to explore experimental styles, it can be interesting, but it can also be extremely tedious.
I do agree. I think it is very slow to get through. Definitely because of the style. It's told initially it's paragraphed, but then after you get through the first couple of pages, it begins this one long digressive paragraph that is just full of these attributions that you'd mentioned. We have the narrator saying, according to Fro, or Conrad is supposed to have told this to Weisner, etc. And it's just confused. Like, we don't know what has actually happened. We hear different things happening from different people. Things are mentioned, they're repeated. It's very hazy. And then, as Sam, you had mentioned earlier, the narrator himself is just kind of this shell of a character. We don't know anything about him. He's just an insurance salesman, as far as we know.
Right.
So despite all of that, I do think that the style is important. I don't think it's gratuitous. I think that it is central to understanding the novel. I think that the style is the substance in this novel.
I agree, but that doesn't make it easier to read.
Or a good idea.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'm not saying that it's easy to read or fun to read, but I think that it is meaningful. It has meaning for Bernhard, and it has meaning for me as a reader, but it's bitter medicine. Like, you don't enjoy it, but you can see the value in it. The plot moves forward not through discrete plot points that you can follow, but it's more of seeing things first it's a hint, then it's hearsay, and then finally it's just a memory. The style is kind of dizzying. You could say it's dizzying or dazzling. Like, you can skim it very easily. You don't need to read it closely because there is so much repetition. But I think that it's intentional. It's a novel that you're supposed to keep kind of at arm's length. And I think it's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. I think that the experience of reading this novel, that uncomfortable experience, is created by Bernhard deliberately.
I think you're right. One of the frustrating things about that, though, this is more, I think, to do with what I expect as a reader and the style that I appreciate more. But I really do enjoy turns of phrase. And while that's definitely not the point here, there are gems in here, or at least gems of ideas, if not gems of sentences. James, you had mentioned that the first half was really not good for you. I sort of agree, except there were truly chilling things in the beginning. For example, this won't give anything away. There was a passage where Conrad is talking about how no one can hear you scream. You can yell as much as you want in the Limeworks, and no one can hear you. That is a great addition to that sense of dis-ease that you're talking about, Ed. But because there's so much repetition, smaller nuggets like that get lost, especially if you're encouraged to skim.
I mean, we could read a passage to, for example, to demonstrate why one might skim. Don't find the good passage. Find like a normal average passage as a demonstration of why you might skim, because I think the rest are nuggets.
Right. Well, the reason I was going to pick that good passage I was just talking about is because even though that's a good nugget, there's still a ton of repetition. So it's one sentence's worth of nugget, but the whole nugget is
in the poop.
It's not condensed. It's like a full page maybe, where the nugget itself is just a kernel of that. That's terrible. It's a whole page of this discussion about not being able to hear someone scream, whereas any other book would have it be a single line. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, this book, it's a 200 plus page book. It reads like a 400 page book, and it could easily have been a 100 page book. But the point is the style, as Ed mentioned. You're reading it for the style, but it doesn't mean that you should read it or that it's an enjoyable style, but that's what it is.
Enjoyable is a separate issue from should. Again, I would call back to this idea of bitter medicine. There are things that perhaps might not be enjoyable, but might be worth doing. And I think that the experience of reading this novel, difficult as it was, is not something that I regret. I think that it was a challenging read, but also a rewarding read, ultimately. That's my own particular sensibility. I'll admit that not everybody is going to feel that way, but I think there is something true and meaningful and important that is articulated by the style, and it's articulated by this dull style, but I don't know if it could have been articulated otherwise.
Well, what do you think it is?
I think it has something to do with this idea of paralysis. I think that we're going to have to talk more about that next week when we get into the more in-depth episode. But I think that there is a mimetic quality that the style has that is integrated very thoroughly with the thematic concerns of the novel. I don't think of it as window dressing. I don't think of it as just this ugly experiment that Bernhard tried that could be thrown away and replaced. The style is integrated with the theme. And if the theme is important to you, then it almost necessitates the style.
Right. I agree with you. I think the style is really important. For me, it's disconnectedness or miscommunication. And the style, because it's this constant repetition, it tells you this person says this, and then someone else gives you a conflicting statement, and someone else gives you another conflicting statement. It all works together for me with the theme. So I agree with you that the style is important. And I agree with you that it is bitter medicine, but it is very bitter. And honestly, I don't know if it's worth your time. Like, you have to want to seek out this specific message, I think. It's not even a matter of putting in the work for me, because I don't mind reading challenging works. I think it's just reading this is very tiring, like physically tiring. It'll strain your eyes the way the pages are one giant block of text, the way if you want to not skim but really zoom in, you're literally reading without pause for sometimes like half a page at a time. So it is very difficult to get through. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just very difficult. And for me, I found the first half of the book, as I mentioned, very unappealing to read. And it's really the second half of the book that kind of brings it all together for me and makes it more worthwhile.
It was kind of like a dip for me, where the beginning was really interesting, and then it waned in maybe the middle third, and then I became more interested at the end.
For me, I always think of the style just as something akin to music, as somebody playing a single note on an instrument versus somebody strumming a chord. And with this novel, it's definitely Bernhard strumming a chord. You can't really hear all of the individual notes, but the cumulative effect, I think, is what matters. And sometimes he'll strum this chord and sometimes he'll strum that chord. So even though you don't get these nuggets that you're looking for, Sam, there are passages that are focused on one idea and then passages that are focused on other ideas. So there is some differentiation inside of this massive text, which is enough for me to orientate myself. I can still find my way around, even though, there might be a mention of doctors and how shit doctors are in the beginning of the novel, and then he'll come back to how shit doctors are later in the novel. There is still enough signposting. It's very minimal, but it's just minimally adequate.
Well, to use your music imagery, I would call this sort of in the realm of atonal music, like Schoenberg or another Austrian person, where you're not looking for a nice melody or even nice chords, as you're putting it. But it's an experimental thing, and pleasant sounding music is not necessarily what the composer is going for.
That's the important point here, which is it is not a pleasant read. And if you are going to read it all the way through, I think you have to brace yourself for that. And there aren't a lot of books where you have to say this. In fact, I would say there are very few books. But in this book, you have to prepare yourself to read something that is not just challenging, but I think is actively trying to either disorient you or trying to frustrate you.
I want to bring up what Iad talked about at the beginning, how he's not very well known or sought out here in the US, but he is quite well known and even popular, if you can use that word, in not just Austria, but in Europe at large. It sounds like Britain shares our sensibilities. They also don't seem to care as much about him. So why do you think that is? Why that difference?
I mean, here it would just be a matter of conjecture on my part as to the character of an American and the character of an American reader. But I do think that there is a bleakness, a pessimism, an angst that we find in his work that is not only unappealing to most readers, but very contrary to the romanticized image of Europe that I think most American readers have in their minds. It's not, bohemians sitting in Paris smoking cigarettes and talking about art. It's not The Sound of Music. It's not Rolling Green Hills. It's very dark, very bleak, very unhappy, and still very foreign. Like when you read this novel, it's distinctly un-American. So I think for an American reader, it's not enough to be worth going abroad for, so to speak.
Well, I agree that it is foreign. I didn't really think it evoked any sort of Europe that often. He does talk about traveling, but so much of it has nothing to do with Austria. It has everything to do with this small little town in the middle of the woods. And more so, not even this town. It has to do with this creepy lime works that he has secluded himself away in with his wife. I was very rarely reminded of Europe at all.
It's not intentionally European, but just all of the kind of cultural touchstones that we would look for as a way of orientating ourselves inside of a text are different from American touchstones. The food that they talk about eating, the people's names, the way that they work. Like, to be perfectly honest with you, before I picked up this novel, I was never really sure what a limeworks was. Like, it's just not something that I think has a really strong place in the American vocabulary. Like, it's not alien. It's not a Chinese novel. It's not an African novel, but it's distinct from the American experience as I know it enough that it still feels different. You know, Americans would look at it and say, well, there has to be a trade-off. There has to be story. There has to be something that provides the pleasures of fiction that I normally want from a book that this book definitely is refusing to deliver.
We've talked about this, and I don't remember in which discussion, but I think that it's touching some kind of cultural nerve that is present in European fiction that we in America did not experience. It's set in a specific time in Europe, I think between two world wars. It's not something that Americans really had to deal with, this kind of despair between two world wars. I think that that's a big difference. The society which can produce this work is different from the American society, even at that time. So it does feel very foreign. It feels like it's not something that an American would even think about writing. So it makes it unique in that way. I also think this idea of this put upon genius, the struggling artist, is much more prevalent in 20th century European fiction than it is in 20th century American fiction. In American fiction, this kind of novelist with a writer's block is more comical and lighthearted. It's not dark the way that it can be in European fiction. Like, art is more serious in Europe.
I agree with you mostly, but I do have the feeling, though, that in Bernhard's case, it's genius always in quotation marks. Like, I think that Bernhard doesn't consider Conrad a genius, and I don't think that the reader is also inclined to consider him a genius. I think that we see him as a fool, but we recognize him as a fool only because Bernhard has placed him in the proper context for us to recognize the foolishness inherent in him and also inherent in ourselves.
Yes. Did you see any of that artistic striving that moved you so in Stoner?
No, because I don't think of Conrad as a person who aims to be an artist per se. He doesn't aim to explore the same territory that Stoner wants to explore. I think that he aims to connect with something beyond himself. He aims to connect with something lasting and infinite, but I don't think that it's an important thing to him in the same way that it was important to William Stoner.
Stoner wants to understand things and he wants to impart knowledge. I don't think Stoner was that concerned about making a name for himself that was going to last. It seemed much more of a present tense sort of thing. Whereas here, Conrad is really concerned about the perfect scientific work that shatters the world, even though he never comes close.
Yes, to add on to that, I think that the misery, the unhappiness of Stoner is that he wants to access this happiness, this source of value in life that other people can access. He wants something that is normal and available freely. And the unhappiness of Conrad in the Limeworks is he wants something that nobody can access. It's not just him. Everybody thinks that they might be able to access it, but nobody can.
That's a good way of looking at it.
There are a couple of moments of humor that I enjoyed. My favorite was when he's talking about changing his wife, and there's a throwaway line that said the baker was always there when he was changing his wife. I don't know if you caught that. It was just like half a sentence.
There's quite a lot of humor here. A lot of it's dark humor. I don't know how much I enjoyed it.
I mean, there's some slapstick, like that tape measuring fiasco where the inspector was, crawling around with the tape measure in his pocket looking for it.
A lot of it is kind of slapstick like that. I mean, there's the whole section where Conrad is bugging the professor, where he's describing, oh, how tired you must be. Well, If you're really, if you're trying to go to bed right now, I can leave, but then he keeps talking. There's humor in passages like that, but again, because it's so repetitive, I think that it lends itself more to the insanity of the text rather than the humor, at least for me. And a lot of those kinds of jokes I feel like I had seen before.
Yes.
But also this is from 1970, so who knows if those jokes had parentage here or if it's just one of those things where lots of people have written such jokes.
I honestly didn't find it to be especially funny. Like, there is humor and absurdity, but I think that this was much more absurd than humorously absurd, if there is a difference in your mind. But I think for Bernhard, the effect was more the absurdity of human ambition rather than to emphasize any particular silliness or lightheartedness.
Yeah, I was actually going to say exactly the same thing, in that there's so much absurdity, but very little of it crosses over to humor. And I think it ends up in the realm of madness instead.
What I think it might be like is the novel is an abyss. It's like looking down into a well. And when you look into darkness for a long time, your eyes become more powerful and they can spot little bits of light more easily. And because this novel is such a dark abyss, whatever lightness there is stands out even more strongly than it would otherwise. Because we are so loath to look at something that is so bleak and so bereft of joy, whenever there's something that could be even slightly funny, we're like, oh, funny, funny, funny.
Okay, let's pause here for a break. When we come back, we'll talk about if we would recommend this book. Welcome back. So, would you guys recommend this book?
I would, but not to everybody. You really have to know who you're talking to. And for certain people in my life, yes, I would, because I know who they are and what their sensibilities are. But this is the type of book, for most people, I wouldn't even mention it.
I agree with the last point. I don't know how often this would come up with most people, most readers I know, but there are definitely readers out there who would appreciate this book. I almost said enjoy, and I think that's a tough sell. But there are things to appreciate in this book, and there are readers who can do that, but they are going to be not your typical reader.
4.2 stars on Goodreads, which makes it one of our more highly rated books, incidentally.
All European, you think?
Probably, I'd wager.
I don't know. I wonder if it's just me or just us, that 2/3 of us are just not into it.
No, I don't think so. I think the comment that we made for The Tunnel a couple of weeks ago would apply here. I think you would read this book as a part of a broader study of, let's say, 20th century Austrian writers or books of a certain philosophy or movement. Like, you would read it as part of that kind of survey course. But outside of those ideas, I don't think you would read it. It's definitely not popular fiction by any means. Like, even in its murder mystery clothing, it is not at all popular fiction. So you would never recommend it to anyone who wants a light read.
I wouldn't, but I do think that there is a reader who would read this not particularly with an academic mindset, but just with the appreciation of a work of art. This is something that's perhaps way too large for this review, but I do think that there exists in fiction a typical balance between the desire to entertain and the desire to elucidate or illuminate something through a work of art. And this book is not aiming to entertain at all. And I think that it's quite distinct from all of the other books that we've read so far, because I think all of the other books that we've read so far have at least some desire to entertain. And if that's your concern, if you want to be entertained, this is not the right novel for you. But, just for me personally, this is the second Thomas Bernhard novel that I've read. And I've already got the third one sitting on my bookshelf, just waiting. So it does scratch the itch for certain readers, but not everybody has that itch.
It's funny, you mentioned Beckett earlier, and I can see why you made that comparison, but I would read every single work of Beckett gladly, probably before returning to Bernhard.
Well, Beckett's funnier, right?
Beckett's funnier, I guess. But it's also, I think part of it is the general style that I get the sense is very Bernhard, the repetition and the lengthy quality to say the same thing over and over. That made it hard for me to digest.
I think that's more of a tonal comparison.
Right.
There are more moments of levity and lightness in Beckett, but I think the attitude towards man's existence in the world is shared. I think they both have a very fatalistic outlook where life is hopeless, real connection is impossible, and yet we have no choice but to continue. That, to me, that sentiment is identical in both Beckett and Bernhard. So I would say that the reader who likes Beckett a lot should at least try reading Bernhard's work.
Let's conclude here. Where we way off base with our review of this book, doubt it. We'd love for you to let us know on Reddit. You can find that link below. And you can find us on social media at CanonicalPod. Once again, you can also find our bookshop.org link, which is also in the episode description. We'll be back next week with an in-depth discussion of the Limeworks. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of this book. We've given you plenty of warning, so settle in, budget a lot of time, or just skim. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.